I've seen the Lord. It's what Mary said as we saw in that reading. It's the title of my sermon, but also it's a testimony, I hope, for every one of us as we go from this place today. Let me show you a short film. Every year, my family try to gather together. We're scattered across France and Britain, and we try to gather together and meet for a meal. A few years ago, we decided to gather and meet at Salisbury. That was a time when it was still safe to eat there. But we went there, we gathered 21 of us, it was really good, and we had a good meal. And then we decided time to go home, take the two kids home, and off we drove. But then the car spluttered and ground to a halt. We turned the key, started going again, drove off. But then the warning light came on to say engine fault. And we spluttered and eased our way up a hill, and the car started to get worse and worse. It was not going to get us home, we realized. So we pulled into a McDonald's to see what we could do. And I did what every man does in those situations. I opened the bonnet and looked inside. I don't know what we think we're going to see. Maybe a big arrow that says points to a button that says press to restart. But there was no arrow, there was no button. And I could see everything was broken. I could do nothing about it. So I got on to the breakdown service and called them. But this was between Christmas and New Year. I think there might have been lots of call-outs. There might have been fewer breakdown vans on at that time. But they said, okay, we're going to be some hours before we can get to you. So there we were in McDonald's. If you've ever been at McDonald's, you'll know there's nothing to do there. I said, kids, we're just going to have to wait it out, tough it out. You know, the food's inedible here. Well, that's what I told them. So we're just going to have to wait here and sit and twiddle our thumbs. It was dark by the time I got a text to say the breakdown van is on the way. Now, if you've ever broken down, you'll know there's no more wonderful sight than seeing that breakdown van hove into view. I could have run up and kissed the man. He might have been a bit alarmed, but he was there to sort out what I could not. And it was wonderful. And there he managed to get us to safety. 2,000 years ago, we can only imagine how distressed the people felt. Those who had encountered Jesus in his ministry, in his love and miracles and acts of great wonder. They'd heard him speak. They'd heard him minister, and they'd personally felt him close to them. But then he went from hero to zero in a matter of moments, as it were. He was arrested, he was beaten, he was mocked, he was spat upon, and he was nailed between two criminals with a sign over his head, "This is the King of the Jews." Not intended to mean what it said, perhaps, but it was a mocking sign over his head, and everything was broken. The disciples had fled, Jesus had bled, and their master was dead. Betrayal, cowardice, stupidity, recklessness, denial, all played their part leading up to that time. Dreams were shattered, and Jesus was laid in the tomb. For them, everything was broken. Then we read this. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. This comes from John's gospel. John has many, many themes that run through his gospel. One of them is light and dark. And every time you see light or dark, the reader needs to take note and see what is going on here. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. We can't really know what was in Mary's heart. Why was she going there? What was her intention? Was she looking for hope? Was she looking for consolation? Was she going to mourn? What she would see that day would be a game changer, a life changer, a revelation. Now, the preacher often talks about going to the foot of the cross. Go to the foot of the cross and see Jesus dying for your sin. But I would say go to the tomb. Go to the tomb. No matter how your life is, no matter how difficult your life is and broken things may be, even though it's still dark for you, go to the foot. Go to that empty tomb. If there are regrets in your life, go to that tomb, even though it's still dark. If there are shattered dreams in your mind, go to the tomb, even though it's still dark. If there are hurts and wounds that fester in your life and people you cannot forgive, go to the tomb, even though it's still dark. If you're aware of betrayal or cowardice or stupidity or recklessness or denial in your life or in the lives of others, go to the tomb, even though it's still dark. For what you will see there will be a game changer, a life changer, a revelation. And we see John describe for us 3 different people and 3 different sights and reactions that faced each of them. First, let's take Peter. Peter, who had been a disciple of Jesus for 3 years, who had followed him and seen him minister and been there when Jesus was transfigured on the mountain and heard that voice from heaven saying, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Who had been through so many things, who had said to Jesus, "I will go to the grave. I'll go to prison rather than deny you." But by this time he had done so. Peter had denied Jesus, as you know, 3 times. To a man, to a woman, even to a young servant girl. He couldn't even admit to a young servant girl knowing Jesus. And for Peter, by this stage, everything was broken. Yet summoned by Mary and going with John, who was a faster runner, but Peter being bolder, he was the first to enter the tomb. And he went straight in, saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. He saw the linen strips, the burial shroud, the face cloth in 2 different locations. And he saw, and most importantly, no body. And then we read that alongside John, the disciples went back to where they were staying. Peter saw that empty tomb, but he went back. He could go no further in his heart. Nothing could move him forward. He still couldn't understand. He was stuck. His day of belief would come, but not that day. And maybe you're like Peter. You know, history tells us there's no serious historian that denies Jesus existed. He did exist. But as you look on that empty tomb, you struggle to believe maybe. You've seen the story, you've seen the account, but maybe you just come away, go back home. You're stuck there. You can't do anything with it. But Peter had seen. And when you've seen something like that, there's no way you can unsee it. It's there. And maybe for you, it's there. You've seen it, but you can't unsee it. I wish my brother could unsee some things. He was out late one night with a friend, and he and Tony decided to come back early morning. This was some years ago. He's 9 years older than me, but he came back in the house and he opened the door with the key and walked in. And Mum was coming down the stairs. It was very early morning, and she was coming down the stairs. She was coming to get some clothes that she'd needed, and she came down early morning to get those clothes. The trouble was she was stark naked. Naked as the day she was born. She thought no one would be around, and there she comes down face to face with my brother and his friend. Sometimes you want to unsee some things, don't you? Peter saw that empty tomb, and it was a start of a life-changing journey. But that's not enough. And the hint is in the text here that it's not enough to see and go back to life as normal. Peter was not commended for what he did. The second character we see is John, the disciple whom Jesus loves. If you don't pick that reference up, that's Jesus' closest disciple, the one who was in on everything that Jesus wanted to show them. Yet John had watched passively as his closest friend died on a cross. He was there at Golgotha. He was there, and Jesus actually spoke to him from the cross and said, Mary, here's your son. John, here's your mother. He was that close, yet didn't do anything to intervene. And John was summoned by Mary to this tomb. And he arrived. He was a fast runner, but he was more cautious. And we see that he bent over and looked in, but he didn't go in. You remember when Jesus came to earth as a baby? He was laid in his tiny form in a manger that drew people to bow low and investigate. So it was with the tomb. John had to bend to look in and see what was going on, almost bowing to the reality of what had happened there. And he would be drawn and come to know what that meant. And eventually we see he did eventually go inside, but he saw and believed. If you read on, he didn't understand. You'll see that he didn't understand. And it is possible to believe and not fully understand everything. Please know that. You don't have to have all the answers. You can believe and still say, well, there are still some things I don't understand. And that's where John was. And it's a better response than Peter had, because he actually believed, whereas Peter didn't. But it's still not enough. He didn't just see, he believed, and yet his response was incomplete and inadequate. So the third character that John the Gospel writer shows us is Mary. She had been a follower of Jesus also from the early days, one of the many women who were indebted to the ministry of Jesus. For Mary had been inhabited by troubling spirits, and Jesus had released her, set her free, and her life was changed, and she followed Jesus from that point on. She wasn't one of the disciples, but she was one of the supporters, probably contributing financially and supporting Jesus any way she could. And she also had been there at Golgotha to watch Jesus die. She had wept with the other women. She had been brave enough to go there and not flee like some of the disciples. But the one who gave Mary Magdalene life was now himself dead. So her healer was destroyed, and for her everything was broken as well. And we read that early on that first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed. Mary went, probably with other women, but the gospel writer doesn't want us to focus on those other women just now. He just wants 3 people in our mind's eye. We know there's more because Mary says, we don't know where they've taken him. But we just are focusing in on Mary because that's who we're supposed to focus on. Maybe she went to offer last preparations of the corpse of Jesus. But if the stone was rolled across the tomb and she knew that would be, why would she go there? But she cared enough to go. She cared enough to go to his place of death. But then on arrival, she saw the tomb was not as it should have been. It should have been sealed, it wasn't. It should have been closed, it was open. The stone had been removed. And that was the most worrying sight of the day for her. And she ran to Peter and John and blurted out, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him. But whereas the men would come and go from the grave, Mary came and stayed there. And seeing an open tomb was not enough for Mary. And if you like, it was the starter for the main course. Because Mary went on to see far more because she stayed with it and endured and rested with that open tomb. What could this mean? She wasn't going to go away until she was sure. And because she stuck with it and stayed there, she saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And because she stayed at the tomb, she encountered far more than the other 2 disciples. She saw Jesus standing there. She didn't realize it was him, but she saw him. And as soon as she realized who this mystery man was, it was in fact Jesus, fully alive, resurrected, she ran to tell the others and said, I have seen the Lord. This is the ultimate seeing. The gospel writer says this Mary is the one we should follow. Not only to see and believe, but to see and believe and tell. And give testimony to say, I have seen the Lord. It's an evangelistic seeing. It's a testimonial seeing. I've seen the Lord. It's what the gospel writer is commending us to do as we read this. It is Mary Magdalene, not even one of the 12, who's the only one to do something with what she has seen. And she throws down a challenge to you and to me and demands a response from us. Now, I don't know if you've seen the news this morning, but there have been bombings in Sri Lanka, targeted on hotels and churches. 127 have been registered who killed just before the service. I checked on the news. 127, many of them Christians. Why? Because they say, I have seen the Lord. Because they stand for their faith, and the world is against the church. The world does not like us saying, talking about Jesus and saying we've seen the risen King. And so they try to silence us. And Mary Magdalene stands in that tradition of people who will not be silenced, who will not be afraid, who will go on saying, I have seen the Lord, and go on telling the world. But John presents us with 3 people for whom everything is broken. An unfaithful Peter, John, who was mourning the loss of his closest friend, and Mary, who had seen the one person who had set her free die on a cross. All their hopes were dashed, yet it was through seeing that they would all eventually come to faith. If you've ever broken down in your car, you'll know that the most wonderful sight is to see someone coming to fix what you cannot. When we have a broken life, when we realize that even our good deeds just make the problem worse, then the most beautiful sight, the most life-changing sight is seeing someone who can change it and clean us up and transform our life. Not that there won't be problems, not that we won't face death, but that he can come and transform our lives. I know it's true because I've tried it, and he has changed my life. But maybe this morning you're like one of those three in the story. It may be like Peter, your past deeds just rankle with your conscience, and you cannot forgive yourself for things that you have done, and you just are burdened down with those things. Peter saw the empty grave clothes and would soon see the one who wore them for 3 days, the risen Jesus. He would be the most beautiful sight Peter could ever have, but not at this point. It may be that you're more like John, and a sense of loss haunts you. John saw and believed, and for him, Jesus was the most beautiful sight he could ever have. And he comes back from death and invites you to say, you'll never be alone again. You'll always have me if you trust in me. It may be that you're like Mary, and other people and other situations that you put your trust in let you down and failed you, and that you feel it's all broken because of that. Well, the risen Jesus is the most beautiful sight you can ever have, and he wants you to see that you're not alone, and he hasn't let you down. And he wants you to go and tell others, I have seen the Lord. Seeing is not enough. Believing is not enough. If we believe really, then we will be compelled to tell the world that has not seen Jesus. Read on in the gospel and you'll see how he records Jesus coming back for an unbelieving Thomas, who wanted to see with his own eyes, who wanted to touch with his own hands. Thomas did see and he did believe. But then Jesus said to Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Some people in this world have gone to the tomb of Jesus, and that's been their conversion moment. You can go to the Middle East and see it there, and for some that's been their conversion point. Others have seen Jesus in a dream, in a bodily apparition, and that has, just like that, and that has been their point of conversion. But Jesus says neither is essential. You don't have to see to believe, but if you believe, then you will see. And John, the gospel writer John, writes all these things so that we may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, not just a man, not just a historical character, but he's the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You don't have to get to see Jesus physically to get life. You have to believe, and that's something we can all do if we choose. You don't have to see to believe, but you do need to believe to see. And having believed, we need to tell the world. We need to be the church, the kingdom of God's people who go and tell the world that he is alive, that he is risen. Peter was quick to deny knowing Jesus. Mary Magdalene was quick to say she had seen the risen Lord. And let's be more like Mary than Peter ourselves. Amen. I want us to do something to end our time together that's very un-British. As the band come up, I want to challenge you to say, have you seen the Lord? You may not have seen him with your eyes, but you might have seen him in the pages of the Bible. You might have seen him at work in your life. You might have seen him and know he's a